France is having record amounts of protests and it's not being covered in the news. The people of France have this one fear in common. They fear that the government will take away their freedoms with a new wave of pandemic laws.
But clearly, there's an anger because some are saying, the government promised us that we would never be segregated, those who get a job, those who don't. And this is exactly what's happening right now.
This is really interesting because obviously we had protests happening all across the world during this pandemic, but I was surprised to find out that even bigger ones are happening right now in France, and surprised because it's not being covered by the news. Let me explain why this is happening right now in France. So here's the two major concerns that the French people have right now: mandatory injections and the separations of people into two different groups, the ones who got the injection and the ones who didn't. Early on, Macron said that there wouldn't be mandatory injections because of freedom of choice and all of that, and there wouldn't be a separation of people who had the vaccine and who didn't have the vaccine. But recently, not only did he make it mandatory for nurses and doctors and people who work in retirement homes, but he also said that it might be mandatory for the rest of the population of France. Take a look at this.
En fonction de l'évolution de la situation, nous devrons sans doute nous poser la question de la vaccination obligatoire pour tous les Français.
So that's a pretty wild statement just on its own, but on top of that, laws are now being passed in France that if you didn't get the injection, you can do things like go to the cafes, cinema, even go to shopping malls or take public transportation as well. Now you might think that that's completely fine, right? But imagine being some elderly person in France who doesn't want this injection and who doesn't have the ability to drive a car. All of a sudden you find yourself in a situation where you're shut down from going almost anywhere. So already there, that's a radical change to the French laws, especially because France has developed this natural hesitancy to get injections over time. And the news media in France is mostly saying that this is due to conspiracy theories. But that's not really the case. I mean, there's always going to be some of that for good and for bad reasons, but France has this complicated history with injections. So if you're old enough to remember all of the failed experiments that's been run in France with injections, that might lead you to not consider this injection. Also, the national motto of France has the word freedom in it, like specifically freedom from a ruling class telling you what to do, the monarchy. It came from the French Revolution. So the freedom to choose on these personal choices is so deeply ingrained in the French people. They don't want a ruling class or a government to tell them what to do and what not to do when it comes to these health choices. They don't have the same mistrust in the government like in the United States, but personal freedom is a huge deal in France. So these new laws being laid out is effectively separating people into two groups, those who didn't get the injection and those who did get the injection. And it goes against the two other words in the national motto, equality and fraternity. I guess brotherhood would be a better translation into English. Fraternity doesn't make that much of a sense, but the sense that everyone's equal and everyone's in it together. So anyways, this new law makes this new health pass mandatory to do most basic things in society. It's called a Pass Sanitaire, and you could actually have this health pass with just a COVID test, but the problem is that you would have to renew it every 2 to 3 days. So unless you get the injection, it makes things very practically difficult. Macron also said that depending on the next couple of weeks, he would have to consider a mandatory injection for all of the French people. So that's the big one right there. I think even if you're the most hardcore injection lover, you should be able to see why this is an issue. Again, practically, he's talking about forcing injections on people who don't want it. I think you're going to see outrage in the streets of France if he actually follows through with this, and hopefully the rest of the world as well. What, you're going to force inject all of these supposed conspiracy theorists, and you think that's going to go over well? What happens when video starts coming out about all of these people being injected against their will? People are going to lose their crap. Look, I understand that it's the role of the government to limit the spread of this pandemic, but I just think it's a bad idea for these nation leaders to come out against the will of the people always, right? And be like, maybe we should force inject all of these people. Wouldn't that be a good idea? then obviously there's a backlash, and every single time these nation leaders are like, okay, we're gonna back off a little bit. it, it happened in Denmark as well. I just don't like restrictions. I understand a lot of it makes sense. I just don't get why these nation leaders are like, maybe we can get away with forcefully injecting all of these people. It's like, who do you think you are? You're supposed to represent the will of the people, you politician weasel. So freedom in general has been a huge issue throughout this pandemic in France. Earlier this year, Macron introduced a new bill called Article 24. This Article 24 would prohibit journalists, but also just regular people, from filming the police in action. So you could no longer film the police in certain circumstances. And obviously it speaks against the freedom of the press and the freedom of the public. Like, if you're the public, that's your defense against a potentially corrupt police. If you feel like they're mistreating you, your defense is that you have a camera and you can record things. So Macron introduced this bill, and it was supposed to prohibit everyone from filming the police officers when they were on duty. This was pretty radical and controversial as well, because it came right after a bunch of videos came out of police officers beating down on like people in captivity who had already been secured. And you just see like three police officers ganging up on this guy and beat him down. So right after this bill was introduced. So not only was it like a moment in time that caused a lot of protests in France, but at the same time, it again goes against the whole feeling of nationality in France, the whole feeling of everyone's equal. Like, we don't have a ruling government over us. We elect democratic leaders who represent us, but we don't want to go back to a time where people rule over us and just make laws and just has a police force that can do whatever they want. So this really has been a year of protests in France, and really a test of our democracies, not only in France, but also the rest of the West. But more importantly, what it has showed us is the fear of a lot of people could be real, that our leaders will, if left unchecked, like Macron, will take over more control and power if people don't stand up against it. I try to be balanced because I want these governments to do a really good job at hindering this pandemic in the most effective way they can, while staying within the framework that we the people have given the governments. But if you during this pandemic, if you look at it, if you don't see people losing their rights in our democracies across the West, then you're just not looking. A good example of this is how the Biden administration is now openly saying that they're going to work with Facebook to take down people and posts that they find problematic. They say it's to stop conspiracy theories and misinformation, which are very vague terms. The problem, and why I think people should be vigilant, especially in these pandemic times where sometimes governments will use safety to take over more control, is that if we allow them to do it once in one area, they're going to have the right to do it in another area as well. So speaking of being balanced, I'm certainly also happy when I see people stand up against governments that are beginning to try to reach further than they should, further than their role allows them. And by the way, just as a side note, imagine being Facebook, like Biden called them killers on open TV, and they're like, dude, what's happening? We banned all of those articles about Hunter Biden during the election, and we gave your campaign a lot of money, for goodness sake. Anyways, the point is that the relationship between government and people has to be held in check by you and I, the people, otherwise it's just going to get out of control. Forced injections in France. Governments working with social media to take down posts they find problematic. I don't think any of it is a good idea. Before you go, this video was brought to you by no one, because I don't have any sponsors, because I'm not monetized. So it means better videos for you, because you don't get a break like with ads, annoying ads popping up everywhere. But it also means that I don't have any money. So that's what this is water, by the way, in a wine glass. That's how poor I am. Water in a wine glass. My father was right about me. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and have a great day.